Good evening and welcome to This Week in Turkey. It has been a tragic week for Turkey. First off, a Pegasus airline plane flying into Sabiha Gökçen's airport from Izmir skidded off the runway and crashed, breaking into 3 pieces. 3 have been killed and 180 people injured.
With 177 passengers, 2 pilots and 4 cabin crew members, the plane took off from Izmir Adnan Menderes Airport at 5:05 p.m. on February 5, and it landed at Sabiha Gökçen Airport at 6:18 p.m. Governor of Istanbul Ali Yerlikaya shared the following information about the plane skidding off the runway. Unfortunately, the passenger plane could not hold on the runway due to adverse weather conditions. After skidding off the runway, the plane drifted around 50 meters. Then, it fell from a height of around 30 meters, where there is a connection road from the Tem Highway to the E5 highway. Television footage showed the nose of the plane almost completely separated from the rest of the fuselage, which burst into flames following the crash. Minister of Transport and Infrastructure Cahit Turan made a statement regarding the first rescue response. As far as we have been informed, the plane drifted into the field by skidding off the runway as a result of hard landing. Breakage has occurred on the plane. An important part of passengers left the plane by their own means. The ones still on board are being evacuated by our teams. Around 32 ambulances have been referred to the scene of incident. The passengers are referred to hospitals with these ambulances. Prosecutors in the capital Ankara launched an investigation into the incident. Sabiha Gökçen Airport was temporarily closed to air traffic following the accident, with scheduled planes redirected to the new Istanbul airport. The airport was reopened to flights at 4 a.m. on January 6.
A total of 41 people have been killed and 75 others injured in 2 avalanches in the Bahçesaray district of the province of Van.
36 of those killed were part of a search and rescue team hit by the second avalanche as they tried to find a group of people missing after the first. The first avalanche occurred due to bad weather conditions and struck a snow clearing vehicle and a minibus late on February 4. The vehicle's operator and 7 passengers escaped alive, while 5 people were killed. Around noon on February 5, rescue workers looking for victims from the previous avalanche were struck by the second avalanche. Interior Minister Süleyman Soylu told reporters before leaving for Van that a minibus buried in the first avalanche was found some 5 meters below the pile of snow. It is a rough terrain to use vehicles to clear the snow. Crews can work only using shovels and sticks, he said. Speaking to state-run Anadolu Agency, Van Governor Mehmet Emin Bilmez warned that more avalanches could occur, cautioning locals to follow the instructions of the emergency personnel on site.
8 Turkish military personnel have been killed in an artillery shelling by Syrian government forces in Syria's Idlib province on February 3.
The Turkish Defense Ministry stated that reinforcements had been sent to the region for the purpose of preventing conflicts in the Idlib de-escalation zone. While this was the case, artillery shelling on Turkish positions near Sarakeb early on February 3 were carried out by the Syrian regime forces, killing 5 soldiers and 3 civilian contractors and injuring 7 more soldiers. The ministry further added that 30 to 35 Syrian troops had been killed in the retaliatory attacks. The Turkish military maintains 12 observation posts in Idlib to monitor a 2018 de-escalation agreement that has been frequently violated by both sides. We are determined to maintain the operations that we carry out to ensure the security of our country, our nation, and of our brothers and sisters in Idlib, President Tayyip Erdogan told reporters. Those who try to test Turkey's determination through such despicable attacks are severely mistaken. President Erdogan warned Russia to stay out of Ankara's dealings with Damascus over the shelling, telling Moscow not to stand in our way. On Friday, he threatened to use military force if the situation in Idlib was not returned to normal quickly. The Russian Defense Ministry said Turkish military units came under fire overnight near Sarakeb after they made advances inside the Idlib de-escalation zone without notifying the Russian side. A spokesman for Turkey's ruling Justice and Development Party, Ömer Çelik, rejected the claim, saying, Turkey gives regular and instant information to Russia. The information was given in the latest incident too. Idlib is home to some 3 million people. The violence there has accelerated in recent months despite several ceasefire efforts. UN regional spokesman David Swanson said that about 500,000 people had fled their homes since December 1st. The UN has also documented the deaths of 290 civilians in the past 2 months, but it expects the actual number to be much higher. The latest displacement is severely exacerbating shelter and accommodation shortages in the region. Turkey hosts more than 3.5 million Syrian refugees and is wary of a fresh influx.
Turkish and Ukrainian leaders on Monday pledged to boost bilateral economic ties at a trade forum in Ukraine's capital, Kiev.
At the forum, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said trade between the two countries rose 10.2% last year to $4.8 billion, adding that the Turkish contracting sector has also signed 184 projects worth a total of $6.3 billion in Ukraine. Erdogan and his Ukrainian counterpart, Volodymyr Zelensky, spoke about current and future cooperation in the trade, economic, and investment sectors, stressing the goal to boost bilateral trade to $10 billion. Erdogan also said they will work on developing partnership to strengthen strategic sectors such as the defense industry, technology, communication infrastructure, and telecommunications. Erdogan further emphasized Turkey's support for Ukraine's territorial integrity, underlining that Ankara doesn't recognize Russia's illegitimate annexation of Crimea in 2014. He said that Turkey will help build housing for nearly 500 Crimean Tatar families that were forced to move to mainland Ukraine following Moscow's takeover of the Black Sea Peninsula. He called Turkey and Ukraine strategic partners.
This evening, a former member of the Turkish parliament, Suat Kınıklıoğlu, is on our Skype line. Good evening, Mr. Kınıklıoğlu. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here.
So there have been angry statements coming from high officials of Turkey as a result of the death of 8 military personnel in Idlib at the beginning of the week. These statements go as far as to say that forces attached to the Syrian regime in Idlib are henceforth legitimate targets for Turkey. Do you think now Turkey is going to be dragged into a long and prolonged conflict in Syria?
Actually, I don't think so. The tone coming out of Ankara in the last 2 days indicates that Ankara is not interested in a full-blown confrontation with the Syrian regime, which is obviously supported by Russia. Tomorrow, a Russian delegation is scheduled to arrive in Ankara, and there will be talks between the two sides. So this is probably what needs to be watched. But from both President Erdogan's messages since the incident, and also from all other official channels in Ankara, it seems Ankara is not interested in a full-blown confrontation, but wants to establish a better bargaining position if and when the time comes for a bargaining process. Especially by creating facts on the ground, such as maintaining and increasing military capacity in Idlib and also other smaller counties that are close to Idlib.
So, well, indeed, I mean, there have been other officials such as Mevlut Çavuşoğlu who have made statements suggesting that they wanted to talk and they were not at war with Russia and so forth. So it does seem that a crisis might be prevented in that sense. But do you think that the strategic goals Turkey has in the region will be compatible with those of other forces in the region?
Well, that's more difficult because Turkey's policy, which has never been really fully articulated by Ankara, seems to be defined as protecting the so-called civilians in Idlib. Of course, the picture in Idlib is much more complicated than just painting them as civilians. Indeed, there are civilians, and a good number of them, but there are also an important number of jihadists and radicals there, which the Russians and the Syrians obviously want to get rid of. That is one part of the equation. The second one is President Erdogan developed a very close relationship with President Putin in the expectation that he or this special relationship would deliver in the end and produce results for Turkey, which obviously does not want more Syrian refugees coming into the country, but secondly also feels obliged to protect what they now call the Syrian National Army, what used to be called the Free Syrian Army, but also elements whose full identity would be difficult to describe depending on which country leadership you were asking it. So Turkey has become a guardian of what 2.5 million people who live in Idlib, which includes jihadists and radicals. Obviously, Turkey doesn't entertain the idea that it protects HTS and others, but it's a more humanitarian discourse. But the strategy is fraught with one major difficulty. The airspace in Idlib is controlled by Russia. And regardless of how much land force capacity you bring into the theater to oppose the Syrian Arab Army or its allies, without air power or air superiority in the region, it doesn't mean much. So putting all of Turkey's baskets into Putin's relationship with President Assad is a very risky strategy, especially when you have soldiers on the ground which are vulnerable due to the absence of air superiority. The second point is, in the end, where Turkish soldiers at the moment are operating is Syrian territory. And the Syrian regime, as despicable as it is, it is the sovereign the sovereign ruler of the country. So there is a contradiction in Turkey's policy, which obviously says it respects Syrian national territorial integrity, but at the same time puts more soldiers on the ground on a daily basis. So the strategy is problematic. It may work if especially the Russians and the Turks come to an agreement whereby perhaps Turkish forces or Turkish observation points would be moved north of the M4 or west of the M5 highway, and some sort of temporary agreement whereby the Syrian regime would control the highways connecting Damascus to Aleppo. But this is still not a very sustainable strategy, because in the end, the Syrian regime obviously will want to make sure to retake control over its full territory. So it's a strategy full with risks, and one that doesn't seem to be sustainable.
Mr. Kınıklıoğlu, I want to go back to something you said earlier. You mentioned that in Idlib, as much as there are civilians, there are also jihadists and rebels. Now, Turkey has mentioned, that it cannot take in any more refugees due to the already existing number of refugees that are within the Turkish borders. But other than this influx in numbers, should Turkey have a security concern relating to the profile of the move of people from Idlib?
Yes, it should. And also, one should not underestimate if Turkey will have to abandon Idlib. And if those radical elements will feel Turkey is responsible for abandoning them, then we have a new problem where these radical elements who might be escaping from Idlib may want to take revenge from Turkey for not protecting them enough. So you have a double you have a double equation with risks. Of course, you also have people who could be crossing the border under the disguise of being refugees, but in reality might be quite radicalized people who could be wreaking havoc in Turkey, or become security threats elsewhere. But there's also a risk for Turkey if Turkey will have to abandon and withdraw. And if these radical elements feel Turkey is responsible for their demise, then you have a double-edged sword here that might be costly for Turkey's security.
Well, President Erdogan this week went to the Ukraine. While he was there, he stated that he did not recognize Russia's occupation of Crimea, as well as signing an agreement with the Ukraine, giving them some sort of military support. Now, I'm assuming these agreements and statement might have angered Russia in some sort of way. Is it possible for Turkey to have a dual strategic partnership with both Russia and the Ukraine? Or will there be consequences of this visit?
Actually, Turkey's official position vis-à-vis Crimea since the annexation has been not recognizing it. The reason why it's became so pronounced this time is the timing of the visit and what happened in Idlib. So actually there's nothing surprising or new about Turkey's position on the Crimea. That said, of course, President Erdogan made every effort to show to President Putin that he is capable of maneuvering different actors at the same time. But there's not much Turkey can do on the Crimea except for asking or looking for a more tolerant approach from Moscow vis-à-vis the Crimean Tatars. And as we are currently doing, supporting Ukraine when we can, defense cooperation, and in this trip this was being pronounced. I don't think the Russians or the Kremlin get sleepless over what President Erdogan said there. For the Russians, what matters right now is that they need to get to a stage in Syria where there is a political process and they can get out. They are kind of tired of being the middleman between Damascus and Ankara, and they encourage the leadership in Ankara to speak directly to Damascus and you know, relieve Moscow of this sort of added responsibility of taking care of managing President Erdogan. So they want to get out of the equation and leave this more to the two capitals. But obviously, Ankara is not ready yet to deal with Damascus directly, except for this contact between the security chiefs. So that doesn't mean it's not going to happen. But I don't think the Russians probably are not happy that the optics of the visit that President Erdogan with Zelensky in Kiev, the timing is obviously quite telling, but it's not something that would change the equation either in eastern Ukraine nor in the Crimea. What matters really is that Russia facilitates a situation where President Assad remains in power, regains control of Syrian territory, and Russia can withdraw militarily to some extent out of Syria, succeeding a major victory in a country that was conflict-ridden for so many years.
Yeah. Lastly, Mr. Kınıklıoğlu, I would like to ask you if, in case the rift between Turkey and Russia grows, I mean, they're also on opposing sides in Libya, is there a chance for improvement in relations with with Europe? Is there a chance for the U.S. to win back Turkey, if you will?
Well, the Americans jumped in a quite opportunistic way as soon as the problem between Moscow and Ankara played out a couple of days ago. And they have expressed support and condemned Damascus, Iranian forces on the ground, and Moscow. But the problem is President Erdogan has really burnt bridges with much of the West already. So it's difficult for him to maneuver that. And also, there's not much the Americans really can do on the ground. They're not there. Air superiority is in the hands of Russia. So the Americans really are trying to get back into the game and using this opportunity to somehow win favors with Ankara. And I'm sure Ankara is happy to see that, but it doesn't really mean much on the ground. In Libya, I think the Russian role is more complicated than meets the eye. That said, I think at the moment, direct developments in Idlib I don't think have an impact on Libya. Libya is right now another theater playing with different actors and probably going to flare up pretty soon. But I doubt that President Erdogan will win any favors unless there is a huge humanitarian crisis, which goes into the television screens of European and Western audiences. Then there might be a push on the European side and or the American side to assist Turkey to deal with this humanitarian crisis. But other than that, I don't see a lot of sympathy for Ankara at the moment in Europe for that.
Mr. Kınıklıoğlu, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
It was my pleasure.
Nicholas Danforth, a senior visiting fellow for the German Marshall Fund, focusing on U.S.-Turkey relations, was the guest of Medyascope correspondent için. Danforth assessed the strained Turkey-U.S. relations and weighed whether there is an opportunity for improvement in light of the latest tensions between Ankara and Moscow, as well as what the crisis in the Eastern Mediterranean will entail for future U.S.-Turkey relations.
So let me be the first to say, Turkey's strategy of putting all its hope in Trump to save U.S.-Turkish relations and overcome the disastrous image that Turkey has in every other branch of the United States government has so far worked out more successfully than I expected it to. As you say, on the case of Halkbank, Trump was very eager to delay the next round of prosecution. In the case of the S-400, right, Trump has put off sanctions for going on 6 months longer than we expected. That said, it's still not clear how much longer this approach can last for. And we are, again, even with the S-400 sanctions, for example, to the extent that the United States Senate has been willing to give Trump the benefit of the doubt and hasn't pushed ahead with its own sanctions, that's been in the hope that some kind of compromise can be reached. That's been in the hope that an agreement can be reached where Turkey doesn't activate the S-400s in April as it's promising.
So in a way, the ball is on Turkey's court now.
I think the ball is in Turkey's court, and I think if Turkey did go ahead and activate the S-400s, there would be very little Trump could do. The Senate would take action, just as we ultimately saw with the Halkbank case. Trump put it off for a long time. Now the Southern District of New York is moving forward. Halkbank is facing massive fines for refusing to cooperate. My fear is if there was an improvement, it would come for the worst possible reasons. I mean, we were talking after the U.S. strike on Qasem Soleimani, if the United States, heaven forbid, ended up with a war with Iran, in some perverse way, that could result in better U.S.-Turkish relations, but it would still be in a way that's bad for everyone.
Right.
Similarly, if, in the best case scenario, the current regime offensive in Idlib produces some, minor improvement in U.S.-Turkish relations, that will come at a disastrous humanitarian cost. That will come at a disastrous cost for both the U.S. and Turkish regional interests. And no, my concern specifically on the Eastern Mediterranean issue is that as this escalates, or let's optimistically say if this escalates, and as the crisis deepens, you would have a situation both where, Greece, Cyprus, Israel, Egypt become more tightly locked in an alliance against Turkey, and the United States, because of its domestic and geopolitical alignments, would find itself increasingly siding with Greece, Cyprus, Israel, and Egypt against Turkey. And my fear, not only in the short term is this problematic and would create a deepening U.S.-Turkish crisis, but more specifically in the long run, if you imagine hypothetically a future Turkish government, different political actors come to power in Turkey, even if they wanted to reset relations with the United States, even if a future government wanted to reset relations with, let's say, Greece, let's say, Egypt, to the extent that this bloc of countries had come to define itself, had come into existence in opposition to Turkish interests in the Eastern Mediterranean, my fear is that that would make it increasingly difficult for any Turkish government to reset relations with Turkey and with the United States and with its neighbors. That this would become a permanent rift.
That's very important what you say.
I mean, I think it's a serious concern that I don't think people in Washington are taking seriously enough.
The United States has suspended a secretive military intelligence cooperation program with Turkey that for years helped Ankara target the PKK, 4 U.S. officials told Reuters.
The U.S. decision to indefinitely suspend the program was made in response to Turkey's cross-border military operation into Syria in October against the YPG, the U.S. officials said. The United States late last year stopped flying the intelligence collection missions that targeted the PKK, which both the United States and Turkey classify as terrorists. The U.S. drone flights that took place within the program, in place since 2007, often zeroed in on mountainous territory in northern Iraq near the Turkish border, another official said. Officials from the Turkish Defense Ministry did not respond to a request for comment, but a Turkish official confirmed the program was stopped. The halt to U.S. assistance will test the limits of Turkey's military and intelligence capabilities at a time when its forces are already deployed on multiple fronts in northern Syria and as Ankara mulls deeper engagement in Libya. This makes the anti-PKK campaign more difficult and more costly for Turkey, one of the 4 U.S. officials said.
The Turkish Statistical Institute has announced that the population residing in Turkey has increased from 1.15 million people from the previous year.
Turkey's population reached 83,154,997 as of the end of 2019, a 1.39% rise year-on-year, the country's statistical authority said on Tuesday. While 50.2% of the total population of Turkey were men, 49.8% of the total population were women. Some 92.8% of Turkey's population are living in cities and district centers, up 0.5 percentage points annually, versus 7.2% in towns and villages. Turkey's population density, the number of people per square kilometer, surged 2 people on a yearly basis to reach 107 last year. The population of Istanbul, the most crowded city, rose 451,543 people to reach over 15.5 million people as of the end of 2019. The city makes up 18.66% of Turkey's total population. Located in eastern Turkey, Dersim was the least populous province with 84,660 people, followed by the northeastern cities of Bayburt and Ardahan.
An exhibition entitled Flux, featuring Marina Abramovic and the Marina Abramovic Institute, has opened at Sabancı University's Sakıp Sabancı Museum, along with its conjunction at Akbank Sanat on January 31.
The exhibition will constitute Turkey's first large-scale retrospective of Marina Abramovic, who is one of the pioneers of performance arts in the world. Realized with the joint efforts of SSM and Marina Abramovic Institute, it will introduce video and photographic documentation of performances by the artist, along with live performances developed with MAI and artists who were brought together by an open call and invitation, as well as a section dedicated to the Abramovic method. Concurrent with the exhibition Akış, Flux, at the Sabancı Museum, Akbank Sanat will host a documentary series presenting the history of works by Abramovic, as well as a video gallery featuring numerous works in performance, aiming to explore the legacy of performance art still informing its present. The exhibition will be opened to visit until April 26 between 12 p.m. and 8 p.m., 6 days a week.
That's all from This Week in Turkey. See you next Friday at 9 p.m. Good night.